Hello Year 12s and welcome to this third video in our series of 4 videos on criminal sanctions. In the first video we looked at the 5 purposes of criminal sanctions. In this video we look at community correction orders and the extent to which they are able to achieve each of these 5 purposes. There are 4 things that you need to do while you're watching this video. The first thing is to take the very best Cornell notes that you can. The second thing is to use the pause and rewind functions. Use the pause function if you need to stop this video so that you can take notes. Use the rewind function if you've missed out on any information and you need to go back over that information. The third thing that you need to do is to have your vocabulary sheet open in front of you so that you can include in it definitions of important terms or of any other words that you're unfamiliar with. And the fourth thing that you need to do is to have your summary books open in front of you. As we go through this video, I will give you some guidance as to what you should include in your summary books. Once you've finished watching and taking notes on this video, make sure that you read the pages from the textbook referred to on this slide. And if you find any additional information in that reading that you think is useful, then please supplement your Cornell notes with that additional information. Well, let's get started then. On this slide, I've set out the 2 learning intentions for this video. Make sure that you write these learning intentions down in your Cornell notes. Our first learning intention is that you should be able to describe community correction orders and their purposes. Our second learning intention is that you should be able to discuss the ability of community correction orders to achieve the purposes of criminal sanctions. Let's start with our first learning intention. That is, that you should be able to describe community correction orders and their purposes. The main purposes of a community correction order are to rehabilitate the offender and, through the offender's rehabilitation, to protect the community from the offender. To understand the effectiveness of community correction orders in achieving these 2 purposes, as well as the other purposes of criminal sanctions, you first have to understand what a community correction order entails. A community correction order, or CCO, is a non-custodial sentence which is in the form of an order that contains both mandatory conditions and optional conditions. A non-custodial sentence is a sentence which the offender serves in the community. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the terms community correction order and non-custodial sentence and write these definitions in there. In a moment, I will explain to you what mandatory and optional conditions are. But first, here are a couple of important points that you must know about community correction orders. First, the maximum term for which a community correction order can apply to an offender is 5 years. Second, before a court can impose a community correction order on an offender, the offender must consent to that order. This is important because one of the main purposes of a community correction order is to rehabilitate the offender. The first step in rehabilitation is for the offender to recognize that they have a problem, that is, that they need rehabilitation. And that's why it's important that the offender voluntarily agrees, that is, consents, to being subject to a community correction order. Third, if the offender breaches any of the conditions of their community correction order, then the offender can be put in prison or fined. Fourth, a community correction order may be combined with either a fine or up to 1 year's imprisonment. That is, an offender may be given a bit of a cocktail of criminal sanctions. If the offender is going to serve a term of imprisonment in conjunction with the community correction order, then that term of imprisonment must be served first, and the combined term of imprisonment and the community correction order must not exceed 5 years. And fifth, when a court imposes a community correction order on an offender, it might decide to record a conviction against the offender. That is, the offender will have a criminal record. Or alternatively, the court might decide not to record a conviction so that the offender does not have a criminal record. Where a court imposes a community correction order, this means that the court requires the offender to comply with the conditions that are set out in that order. There are two types of conditions. The first type is mandatory conditions, and the second type is optional conditions. Let's now look at each of these types of conditions in turn. Mandatory conditions are conditions that the judge or magistrate must include in every community correction order. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term mandatory condition and write this definition in there. So, all community correction orders must include conditions that require the offender to stay in Victoria, that require the offender to notify any change of their address or employment to community correctional services, that require the offender to report regularly to a community corrections officer, and that require the offender not to commit an offence that is punishable by imprisonment while the offender is under the community correction order. Now let's look at optional conditions. Optional conditions are conditions that the judge or magistrate may include in a community correction order. That is, that the judge or magistrate can choose to include in a community correction order for an offender because the judge or magistrate thinks that those conditions are appropriate to the particular circumstances of the offender. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term optional condition and write this definition in there. Note that even though these conditions are referred to as optional conditions, it is not optional for the offender to comply with them. Instead, it is the judge or magistrate who has the option of imposing these conditions. Where a judge or magistrate does decide to include an optional condition in a community correction order, then the offender must comply with that condition. If the offender does not comply with that condition, then the community correction order could be revoked and the offender could instead be fined or jailed for the offence that they have committed. There are a number of different optional conditions that a judge or magistrate can decide to include in a community correction order. I've listed some of these on this slide. Where the offender has been convicted of an offence that is caused by drug or alcohol addiction, for example, where the offender has driven while under the influence of an alcohol addiction or has robbed someone to obtain money to feed their drug addiction, then an optional condition might require the offender to undertake treatment for their drug or alcohol addiction. Likewise, where an offender has been convicted of an offence that is caused by their inability to control their temper, for example, where the offender has assaulted another person in a fit of rage, then an optional condition might require the offender to undertake anger management counselling. An optional condition might require the offender to participate in a training or education program. This will be appropriate where the purpose is to assist the offender to obtain a job so that they are able to earn money and use their time productively rather than fall into a life of crime. An optional condition might require the offender to obey a curfew. This means, for example, that the offender must be home by 10 p.m. each night. This condition can be imposed where the offender has been causing trouble at night, for instance by vandalising property under the cover of darkness. An optional condition might prohibit the offender from entering certain no-go zones. For instance, if the offender suffers from alcohol addiction, the offender may be prohibited from entering a pub. An optional condition might prohibit the offender from associating with specified people. This is called a non-association requirement. For instance, the condition might prohibit the offender from associating with people who have criminal records. This is a way of trying to ensure that the offender does not mix with criminals and fall back into a criminal lifestyle. An optional condition might require the offender to live at a specified residential address. This is called a residency requirement. For instance, if an offender is very young, that offender might be required to live with their parents or a guardian. An optional condition might require the offender to perform unpaid community work. The maximum amount of unpaid community work that an offender can be required to perform is 600 hours over the term of the community correction order. For instance, an offender who has been convicted of vandalism may be required to spend time cleaning graffiti off public buildings. Finally, an optional condition might require the offender to submit to some kind of monitoring and supervision. For instance, the offender might be required to wear an electronic bracelet so that the authorities can track where the offender is at all times. One way in which you can describe the operation of a community correction order is by saying that a community correction order uses a carrot and stick approach. The carrot and stick approach is what is used to get a donkey to move. The carrot is the incentive that is dangled in front of the donkey so as to encourage the donkey to walk forward, as the donkey will want to eat the carrot. The stick is the punishment that is given to the donkey if it refuses to walk forward. In other words, the stick is used to try to force the donkey to walk forward. Now, if you do use the carrot and stick approach to describe the operation of a community correction order, then you must explain what that means. In the context of a community correction order, the carrot is that the offender is allowed to stay in the community. A community correction order is a non-custodial sentence. And the offender is given assistance to rehabilitate where that rehabilitation can remove the underlying cause of the offender's offending. This rehabilitation is achieved through the optional conditions in the community correction order. For instance, where the offender has committed the offence because of a drug or alcohol addiction or because of anger management issues, the community correction order may include an optional condition that the offender must undertake drug or alcohol addiction treatment or anger management counselling. If this rehabilitation is successful, then the offender should no longer be driven to offend. On the other hand, in the context of a community correction order, the stick is the mandatory condition in the community correction order that the offender must not commit an offence that is punishable by imprisonment while under the community correction order, and the fact that a breach of this condition is punishable by imprisonment or a fine. In other words, if the offender does reoffend while under a community correction order, then the offender will be hit with the stick of imprisonment or a fine, in addition to whatever punishment is imposed for that offence. This is intended to achieve the purpose of specific deterrence, that is, to discourage the offender from committing further offences. In summary, a community correction order is intended to achieve rehabilitation by offering the offender the opportunity to remain in the community and assisting the offender to change their attitude or behaviour, while also achieving the purpose of specific deterrence by threatening the offender with imprisonment or a fine if the offender reoffends. You'll recall that our second learning intention requires you to be able to discuss the ability of community correction orders to achieve the purposes of criminal sanctions. In this table, I'm going to set out the points that you could make when you are discussing the ability of community correction orders to achieve the purposes of criminal sanctions. So make sure that you include this table in your summary books. You can see that I've set out each of the purposes of criminal sanctions across the top of this table. Let's turn first of all to punishment. a community correction order is moderately effective at achieving the purpose of punishment. It punishes an offender by imposing restrictions on what the offender can do. For example, where an optional condition requires the offender to perform unpaid community work, the offender is restricted from doing things that they might like to do. Instead of watching the footy on a weekend, they must spend that time cleaning up graffiti. And where an optional condition requires the offender to obey a curfew, the offender is restricted from going out at night and, for instance, partying with their friends. So in that sense, a community correction order is effective in punishing an offender. However, it's only moderately effective at punishment, as it is not nearly as harsh a punishment as would be imposed on the offender if they were sentenced to a term of imprisonment. As with punishment, a community correction order is moderately effective at achieving the purpose of specific deterrence. By imposing restrictions on what the offender can do, such as through optional conditions that require the offender to perform unpaid community work or to obey a curfew, a community correction order can discourage the offender from committing further offences. This is because the offender will not want to be subject to those restrictions again if they commit a further offence. In addition, as I've explained, a community correction order includes a stick. This stick is the mandatory condition in the community correction order that the offender must not commit an offence that is punishable by imprisonment while under the community correction order, and the fact that a breach of this condition is punishable by imprisonment or a fine. The purpose of this stick is to achieve specific deterrence by discouraging the offender from committing further offences. However, as with punishment, a community correction order is only moderately effective at achieving specific deterrence because it does not impose on the offender consequences that are as severe as the consequences of imprisonment. In other words, a community correction order is not likely to be as effective as imprisonment at achieving specific deterrence. In addition, a community correction order is not very effective as a general deterrent. This is because a community correction order is seen as a fairly soft alternative compared to imprisonment or even a fine. As a result, other members of the community are less likely to be discouraged from committing similar offences to the offence committed by the offender just because they might be given a community correction order for those offences. As I've said, one of the main purposes of a community correction order is rehabilitation. And community correction orders are very effective at achieving this purpose because the offender is not put in prison where, as we saw in the previous video, there is a high risk of them reoffending on their release from prison. Instead, the optional conditions included in a community correction order are designed to assist the offender to rehabilitate. For example, if the offender has been convicted of an offence which has been committed because of alcohol or drug addiction, then an optional condition in the community correction order may require the offender to undertake treatment for that alcohol or drug addiction. If this treatment is effective, then it will remove the underlying cause of the offender's offending. This is the carrot that is included in a community correction order. Under a community correction order, the offender is allowed to stay in the community and is given assistance to rehabilitate where that rehabilitation can remove the underlying cause of the offender's offending. However, a community correction order will only be effective in rehabilitating an offender if the offender recognises that they have a problem and is willing to overcome the problem. If the offender does not recognise that they have a need to rehabilitate, then rehabilitation will not be successful. Conversely, a community correction order is not very effective at achieving the purpose of denunciation. This is because a community correction order is seen as a fairly soft alternative compared to imprisonment or a fine. A community correction order is therefore not a very effective way of a court showing its disapproval of an offender's behaviour. In contrast, a community correction order is very effective at achieving the purpose of community protection if it is successful in rehabilitating the offender. This is because if the offender is successfully rehabilitated, then the cause of their offending has been removed, and so the offender should no longer be a threat to the community. However, if the community correction order is not successful in rehabilitating the offender, then it will not be very effective at achieving the purpose of community protection. This is because a community correction order is a non-custodial sentence, and so the offender is free in the community where they're able to reoffend. Well, that brings us to the end of this video. As a result of watching and taking notes on this video, you should now be able to do two things. First, you should be able to describe community correction orders and their purposes. And second, you should be able to discuss the ability of community correction orders to achieve the purposes of criminal sanctions. You now need to read the pages from the textbook that are referred to on the first slide. And if you find any additional information from that reading that you think is useful, then please supplement your Cornell notes with that additional information. The next video that you need to watch and take notes on is the video on fines and the extent to which fines achieve the 5 purposes of criminal sanctions. Thank you very much for your attention.